Grace,
Yes.
do you see my slide or not?
Yes, you do. I see it.
Slide.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Yeah, let me start in 1 minute. Okay. Good morning and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscape Series. And today's session is about engaging the intertidal zone, innovation and tradition in a dynamic landscape, hosted by Professor Natalia Edgeberry from the University of Hong Kong. And this is our 10th webinar session in our webinar series. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Yegang Ko, Program Director of the APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscapes Hub, and the Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at the University of Oregon. And before we get started today's webinar, I just want to mention a couple of things about APRU and our APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscapes program. For those of you who are not familiar with APRU, first of all, APRU is the Association of Pacific Rim Universities. It's a network of 60 leading universities linking the Americas, Asia, and Australasia. We leverage collective education and research capabilities of our members into the international public policy process. The Sustainable Cities and Landscapes program is one of the APRU's primary research programs, and we collaborate on the effective solutions to the challenges of the 21st century. And SCL Hub, it has the 19 core members across the Pacific Rim, and the hub is housed at the University of Oregon. The SCL Hub successfully held 4 annual conferences in Poland in 2017 and Hong Kong from 2018, basically hosted by HKU. And then in 2019, we were in Sydney and then Auckland virtually in 2020. And each conference offered various activities that faculty and students can participate. And we had like a research working groups, a design field school, a student design competition, and research symposium for PhD students. And in 2021, instead of our annual conference, we offered a live webinar series organized by our working groups and celebrating our 5th year. And all the previous webinar recordings are available on our website. And our next webinar will be hosted by Professor McKenna Kaufman from the University of Hawaii and myself from the University of Oregon. And this seminar will be about the importance of a rapid transition to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. But also, we will discuss some of the land use challenges along the way. And using some case studies across the Asia-Pacific region, we will present potential solutions to mitigate land use conflicts, and including improving renewable energy seeding requirements and reassessing the comparable use of land. And lastly, exciting news is the forthcoming Rowridge Handbook of Sustainable Cities and Landscapes in the Pacific Rim. And the handbook explores the new ways of understanding sustainable cities and landscapes. And it will include over 60 case studies across the Pacific Rim, 64 chapters contributed by 116 authors from 38 institutions across the Pacific Rim. So this is coming up next month. So I hope you continue to join us and explore how cities and regions across the Pacific Rim address climate change and social equity to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And please contact us through email and visit our website and Facebook or Instagram if you are interested in participating in our activities. And thank you so much and enjoy today's webinar. I'd like to introduce and pass on today's webinar host, Professor Natalia Etchberry. Hi, Natalia.
Hello. Hi, thank you, Yakan. Let me share my screen.
Yeah, thank you. I need to stop sharing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, find. Oops, did I stop sharing?
Yes, you did.
Okay.
Uh-oh, what happened here? Okay, thank you, Yakan, for inviting us to be part of this webinar series. So today I'm the host. My name is Natalia Etchberry, and the seminar series is presenting Engaging the Intertidal Zone, Innovation and Tradition in the Dynamic Landscape. Intertidal zones are the narrow bands of land between the high and the low tides in both natural and urban settings. They are crucial ecosystems that support biodiversity and provide important ecosystem services. These sites are often rich in social cultural traditions and landscape management practices. Intertidal zones are rapidly declining around the world due to development, reclamation, and resource exploitation, pollution, and sea level rise. So this webinar engages with these dynamics of intertidal zones and their human and non-human inhabitants in two distinct regions along the Pacific Rim. First is Hong Kong at the edge of the Pearl River Delta, and second is Gulf of Tribuga, an area in the Pacific coast of Colombia. In the case of Hong Kong, traditional management practices of the intertidal zone, such as oyster farming, aquaculture, agriculture, are in decline, while habitats and ecologies are being threatened by coastal development through land reclamation. The Gulf of Tribuga, on the other hand, has always been neglected by the state. It is one of the world's biodiversity hotspots and is now threatened by the development of a deep water international port. This presentation will address issues related to social cultural practices of communities living in these landscapes. It will review ecological engineering strategies for regenerating hard coastal edges. And it will discuss the pedagogical methods that are cultivating rich design education through engagement with the intertidal zone. We have three panelists, and I will introduce them in order of the presentations. The first one is it's myself. My name is Natalia Etchberry. I'm a senior lecturer, and I'm the MLA and PDLA program director of the Division of Landscape Architecture at HKU. Dr. Juan Carlos Astudillo is a research associate in the State Key Laboratory of Marine Pollution in the City University of Hong Kong. And Pedro Aparicio Llorente is the principal of APLO Architecture and Landscape and an adjunct assistant professor at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. So just to start, I'm going to start with the first presentation, which is about engaging in the intertidal zone, pedagogical methods for design education. So I will introduce the work from three studios that have engaged in intertidal. Sorry, I need to turn up my WhatsApp. I'm sorry, my WhatsApp. Okay. Okay, so I will introduce the work from 3 studios that have engaged in intertidal zones of Hong Kong and the Pearl River Delta. This is part of a 3-year teaching effort dealing with coastal issues and shifting from a very large scale of the PRD to a smaller site scale of Tung Chung in Hong Kong. I would like to reflect on how the engagement with these visibly dynamic sites as a platform for students to engage with deeper and more nuanced notions of complexity in the design education. The studio sits within the 2-year MLA program at HKU and is the 3rd and final studio before their thesis. Within our curriculum, the 3rd studio deals with increasing complex and challenging projects, focuses on the interrelationships of landscape systems and human development, and calls for integration of multiple factors which shape our physical landscapes, including ecology, community, and social parameters. This 3-year studio effort has worked in parallel with architecture studios, has exchanged with other universities, and has expanded to include interdisciplinary teaching with a marine ecologist. So to start, the first studio that I did was 3 years ago, and it was centered in the Pearl River Delta, or the Greater Bay Area, a region that is in constant flux, where coastal edges have been constantly changed for centuries and now face a host of environmental challenges. In the last 50 years, with the Delta intense urbanization, many of these dynamic edges have been reclaimed with coastal development. As you could see in the image, the red is the landscape and the gray is the new urbanization, and the blue is the water, but there's a lot of land reclamation happening in the south. So the studio began with an exercise called Tracing Change, where the students identified and examined patterns of change that have shaped selected landscapes along the PRD in the last 30 years. So they took, for example, here an island, and in the last 30 years, just looking at how reclamation has transformed completely the surrounding from agriculture and aquaculture to now a port area. Students documented how mudflats, marshes, mangroves that existed along the richly sedimented delta coastal fringe have been reshaped and reclaimed by burns, canals, roads to shape wet and dry agriculture, aquaculture, and villages. In this case, it's in Maipo, and how actually the mangrove expansion and control happens every 15 years, that they need to cut some of the mangroves. And this is more of a typical condition in the PRD, where basically oyster farms that existed before get converted into aquaculture, and then urban areas, and then high density settlements currently. Today, change continues. New transformations are afoot. New investment, new infrastructure, new visions, and new threats will all shape this landscape just as dramatically in the next 50 years. So learning from that exercise, students then articulated a development and adaptation scenario for a site within a time frame of 30 years, proposing landscape-driven interventions that responded adaptively to future conditions. So this studio project was sited in Long Shui Island, south of Guangzhou, and this was originally an alluvial plain and was initially reclaimed for agriculture and aquaculture, and most recently it became a major port island. The students critiqued the massive seawall construction being planned, and instead proposed a few natural edge conditions that would replace low-lying former agriculture into a horizontal levee that would adapt over time and protect for sea level rise. This would allow for tourism and ecological programs. So the PRD sites are in many ways similar to Hong Kong. The cultural practices of managing this landscape historically are more or less contiguous with those practices found in Hong Kong. At the top, you see like the natural processes of transforming the intertidal zone or managing, and at the bottom are more of the artificial or the hard scale transformations that are happening at the edge. So the last 2 years, the studio has been centered in Tung Chung Bay and Valley, and which is a mashup of Hong Kong's past and future on the northern coast of Lantau Island, which is directly across from the forever changed, and well, it's directly across and forever changed by the massive artificial island of the Hong Kong International Airport. From the ecological perspective, Tung Chung's ecology is an important remnant fragments of bay, estuary, and valley, home of rare and threatened species and habitats. Settlement of this valley can be traced back to the Song Dynasty and consisted mostly of fishing villages and paddy field agriculture. The intertidal zone stretched deep across the bay with a mudflat. Though all of Hong Kong's agricultural landscape faced large economic transitions starting from the 1950s boom and 1970s decline, Tung Chung's entire context changed with the airport construction in the 1990s. So attendant to the airport, a large highway and Newton called Tung Chung were overlaid on reclaimed land with an extension into the valley. Today, there's been more reclamation around as well, and there is a planned extension into the valley, and with new development of high rises, and also in the eastern side, there's a new land reclamation that will house more than 23,000 people. So the Yatong estate, which is this housing estate in triangular shape, was constructed on the estuary over the intertidal zone on an area of wet culture and over a village. The village today is marked by two contrasting landscapes. The Yatong estate, built on high and fortified at 5 meters above the medium tide against inundation and sea level rise. And the remaining underdeveloped lowland contains mudflats, mangroves, active and abandoned agriculture and aquaculture, and scattered and mostly abandoned villages on both high grounds and stilts, which with contested claims and land rights and compensation. So one of the goals of our master's programs is to graduate students who can recognize and engage with the dynamic interplay of complex systems that shape every site. But in most instances, this is an intellectual exercise. Change has to be imagined and inferred. Intertidal sites offer a different experience to students, and I would like to argue here that the immediate, tactile, and observable landscape scale changes that occur in the intertidal site provide an opportunity to document and engage change in a very practical, hands-on way. Moreover, a facility with visible shifts in the water and mud opens conceptual pathways for students to engage with the more abstract and invisible conflicts and the dynamics that truly shape Tung Chung's potential. In particular, the intertidal interface became an ideal place to understand and problematize the often static concepts of development, ecology, and cultural practices as these dynamic conflicts compete and connect. These learning outcomes were facilitated by a structure and organization of the studios and specified exercise to engage with the changing site. So I'll just go through some of the methodology of the studio. The studio was interdisciplinary. It was co-taught by marine ecologist Juan Carlos, who's going to be speaking next, and took opportunities through the semester to meet with local activists, green groups, and locals. Students walked the site with these groups and participated in their ongoing practices of working within the landscape. In this case, we went to Painai around Deep Bay to do oyster reef restoration in an abandoned oyster farm with the Nature Conservancy. And the students were able to experience the intertidal, one of the largest intertidal areas in Hong Kong, mudflats, and also get kind of into the mud. Second, there was a series of exercises that led to design proposals. A critical exercise for positioning the student work in the dynamics of change was one that we called Intertidal Dissections, where students identified locations of interest in the Tung Chung's intertidal zone. Students then created site habitat inventories and relationship maps and drawing samples, species, pollutants, users, and risks. Drawings portrayed ecological and social relationships, habitats, ecosystems with reference to the section and the surrounding site. So in this case, you had the relationship between village development, which were on stilts, and the oyster habitats, but also kind of showing what were the risks of that in terms of sea level rise and storm surge within each site. In this case, students were looking at the mudflat and how the relationship with the horseshoe crab, which is one of the endangered species of this area, and how they utilize the mudflat in their life cycle. And in this case, we were looking at the seagrass beds, which is also endangered in the site, and how what were the risks and all the different species that related to this area. Although these were small in scope, they provided opportunities for students to identify and trace outward from a specific detail to a much larger landscape system and issue. So they also did kind of identified all the species that existed and did photo essays. And lastly, this exercise, this first part of the exercise, they did time lapse in the intertidal zone. This exercise necessarily began in the intertidal zone itself. So in the duration of 8-hour site visits, students could directly observe and precisely document a tidal cycle and its impact on human and animal activities. So this is the horseshoe crab and the seagrass, which are kind of the endangered species within the site. So starting with the scale of the organism and the detail was an important perspectival shift that encouraged more process-based approaches in the work. It also helped to situate and interpret the large-scale analytical exercises that were paired with it and come up with themes that led to design proposals. So once the students went through this exercise, they would come up with a larger theme. For example, here they talked about an ecological battlefield, and that would lead them to a design proposal. So I'm just gonna show a few brief exercises, final design speculations that the students did that relate to kind of this process that they were taking through. So the first project that I'll show, it's called the Mangrove Machine and accepts the proposed development scheme by the government, but proposes a mitigative strategy to seek coexistence between development and natural environment. The student proposes an eco-engineering solution to accelerate mangrove rehabilitation by designing a mangrove retreat through horizontal levees and natural sedimentation traps. The student then proposes different scenarios of sea level rise that contribute economically and ecologically to the site. So for me, this kind of project brings critical analysis to mangrove restoration projects that are happening around the world. As a second project, this one, the student proposes a series of new oyster reef structures with platforms that allow for adjacent habitats, such as mangroves, seagrass, and horseshoe crabs to flourish and allow for human interaction. This kind of project brings ecology with updated economic and sustainable traditions of aquaculture and brings community engagement, increasing biodiversity and bringing tourism to the site. For this third project, it comes up with a series of strategies to revitalize a village and simultaneously restore the habitats of a horseshoe crab. The student proposes a series of programs that involve community and educational and research facilities. And here, this example shows how ecology can be used for village revitalization. And lastly, this last project proposes a transitional buffer on the coast of Tung Chung that negotiates development and conservation. It proposes sustainable fish pond polyculture, which in the future, which is traditional, and in the future can adapt to sea level rise. The soil from the excavations will be used to form fish pond bonds, which allow for access on higher grounds, and the fish ponds run in cycles, and when the fish pond is drained, it will create feeding opportunities to water birds. Landscape and community recreation areas can also happen around the pond for local communities and ecotourism that can generate additional income to the farmer. So in this case, this example explores how traditional practices that currently exist in Hong Kong can be used to adapt for sea level rise. So as a conclusion for the presentation, just wanted to bring that awareness of climate change and new ideas about environmental stewardship suggest a new lens through which to engage these contested sites and advance new sustainable resilient strategies along our coast. So the next steps for the studio in the teaching of these in studios or even working groups would be to create a larger super studio or working group between different universities in the Pacific Rim that engages with these different issues that are found in the intertidal zone. So I'm going to end here, and I'm going to present the next panelist, which is Juan Carlos Astudillo. So Juan Carlos worked with me in some of these studios, but he is specialized in eco shorelines. He will be presenting biodiversity and ecosystem restoration of degraded and urban ecosystems.
All right.
Share.
Well, thank you very much, Natalia.
Share.
I need to, okay, good. So I'll start sharing. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for letting me be here. I'm not a landscape architect, so I'm quite glad to be here. So my talk is going to be about, as Natalia mentioned, biodiversity and ecosystem restoration of degraded and urban ecosystem. I'm going to focus on artificial shorelines caused by land reclamation. So I'm part of the State Key Laboratory of Marine Pollution at City University of Hong Kong. So I'm not going to show designs or much of designs. I'm going to show what we have been doing to restore these artificial shorelines in Hong Kong. So as a brief introduction, just to put you in context, China, as many other places in the world, have big trouble with land reclamation and artificial shorelines. In China, about 60% of the shoreline has become, sorry, let me put the pointer. Okay, about 60% of the shoreline has become artificial, and this has caused more than 50% loss of coastal wetlands. And indeed, now they call it the new Great Wall of China. Based on a study on the river deltas in China, they found that the main reclamation ongoing is to produce land for mariculture and fish ponds, followed by development and land for agriculture. In Hong Kong, we had the same problem. Artificial shoreline here is about 12% of the total shoreline of Hong Kong. And here is mainly to produce land for the growth of the city and for the industrial areas. For example, one of the largest embankment of Hong Kong in the northeast, called Tolo Harbour and Channel, if we look at the population growth from the 70s to now, it grew from about 100,000 inhabitants to about 1 million. And this has put a lot of stress on the development and land reclamation in the inner part, but also brought a lot of pollution into the ecosystem. If you look at the picture of this area in the 70s, you can see that most of the shoreline and intertidal was natural. And we have different type of habitats and ecosystem like mud flat, rocky shore back here, sandy shore, mangroves. But if you look at this nowadays, all this have gone through land reclamation, and all the seawall, all this beautiful ecosystem disappear and just become a narrow seawall made of granite rocks or concrete. We conducted a study on the biodiversity of these seawalls in Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, we had two main types of seawalls. We had the vertical seawalls that are made of granite blocks and concrete blocks. And we have the sloping riprap seawalls that are made of big boulders of granites. And what we found is that the biodiversity and number of species living in these seawalls is much lower than the natural shorelines for the same area. The reason for this is because the seawalls are designed and built to provide coastal protection against land erosion and wave actions. But these seawalls, they lack all the habitat complexity that a natural shoreline has. And we miss a lot of the microhabitats such as crevices, holes, tidal pools. So we miss that. And these seawalls provide only a homogeneous habitat. Apart from the lack of microhabitats, since the surface is very smooth, what happens in summer when there is a low tide and a high environmental temperature, the surface of these seawalls can reach over 45 degrees Celsius, and even sometimes reach 60 degrees Celsius. So this becomes very detrimental for marine organisms. And if you compare with the natural shoreline or rocky shores that are more complex in texture on surfaces, you see that the crevices hold, there is water containing these pockets. So the overall temperature of the sea or the rocky shore is lower. And many of the organisms that live in the intertidal make use of these microhabitats. Apart from the microhabitat, we also have another problem that has been pointed out by other research related to concrete. Concrete has a smooth surface, but it also has a high pH between 12 and 13, what is very useful to preserve the steel within the reinforcement of the concrete blocks. But it has been pointed out that this high pH may affect the development of biofilm and therefore affect the whole development of the communities on the intertidal. So to try to solve this, ecologists, landscape architects, engineers, and other stakeholders have been trying to find solutions on design and materials to increase the performance of the seawalls to a level close to the natural shorelines. For example, we can, in terms of biodiversity or ecosystem functioning. So this is what in Hong Kong we call eco-shoreline, but it means ecological engineering of seawalls. So eco-shoreline has three main goals. One is to provide shoreline protection, provide services for people such as enjoyment and ecological enhancement. For ecological enhancement, we have different objectives. For example, improve the biodiversity of native species, to try to control invasive species, to improve the abundance of some target species, for example, oysters, and improve the overall ecosystem functioning and process of these artificial habitats. So for ecological enhancement, we have two approaches. One is hard eco-engineering. That is when we intervene with, like, for example, boulders or concrete product to achieve shoreline protection and ecological enhancement. The other approach is soft eco-engineering. That's when we use natural components such as mangrove, shells, or oyster to achieve the same goals. So about eco-shoreline in Hong Kong, this is a very new subject. We have been working on this for the last 5 years, and we have managed to put together a very interesting team of ecologists, civil engineers, landscape architects, and also collaborating with private enterprises to do the different trials and testing to understand what could work and what could not work on the shorelines in Hong Kong, considering that Hong Kong is a subtropical region. So I'm going to show you some of the work that we have been doing in Hong Kong. So our first project on Eco Shoreline started in a collaboration with the World Harbour Project, that is a global researcher from Sydney, Australia. So this was a global initiative that they developed these tiles with different complexity, moving from flat to 2.5 cm ridges to 5 cm ridges, and were deployed in different parts of the world. But in Hong Kong, we deployed in vertical seawalls, and we have two sets, just tiles and tiles seeded with live oysters. And they were compared against the normal seawall. So what we found with this small experiment was that this simple design was very effective in reducing the surface temperature during low tides in Hong Kong. And we found that by increasing the complexity of the tile, we increase the number of species living on them. But what was very interesting as well is that when we seed this tile with live oyster, the number of species increased even in the flat tile. And this is because oyster by themselves, the shell can provide microhabitats for other organisms to live and help to reduce environmental stress. And we also found that most of the species that we found on the tiles were living in these crevices because the environmental stress here was much lower. At the moment, we are conducting several trials and projects in Hong Kong, involved in different aspects, new development, all existing seawalls and new reclamation areas. But for this talk, I'm going to focus on one of the experiments that we have been doing for 2 years, that's testing different components to enhance sloping riprap seawalls and vertical seawalls. So for the vertical seawalls, we have two sections. One section is we install panels. These panels were imported from Israel from a company that we work with. So after 2 years, we compare the biodiversity against the normal seawall. And we also have another approach that is a locally designed tile that we also compare against the seawall. For the tile, we have a different approach. One was to first develop an eco-friendly concrete mixture. And for this, we use waste material from Hong Kong. That one is the incineration sewage ashes that is produced, and dredge marine sediments that usually they have to be dumped somewhere. So with this material, we try to replace cement and aggregates. So we call our eco-friendly concrete mixture M1 and M1C. So we have at the end two types, a concrete mix with normal pH of about 12 and with low pH of 9. And we also have another set of tiles with normal or ordinary Portland cement with normal pH of about 12 and low pH about 9. And the strength was pretty good, about 39 MPa. For the design of the tiles, here we try to include all the tiny microhabitat that we have seen that somehow help different organisms to live on the seawalls. For example, holes, like texture, ridges, crevices, and the ridges are tilted, so during the low tide, they can accumulate water on the back to further help to reduce the heat stress. So some of the results for the panels, after 2 years, what we found is that the number of species living on the panels is higher than the number of species living on the seawall. but it is still lower than the number of species used in the natural shoreline. What we found on the panels is we start finding soft tissue animals, such as tunicates, that usually don't appear on the seawall, but these animals were making use of the small microhabitat, probably to cope with environmental stress or to find a refuge against predators. And we also found that the holes or the panels that are used for the attachment, they were providing a nursery ground for some fish. You see here, these are eggs of this blending. For the tiles, what we found after a year, first with temperature, we deployed these temperature loggers that they measure temperature every 20 minutes. We found that the eco tiles can help to reduce the temperature compared to the control in average. But if we look at the maximum difference, at least for these sites that is in the east of Hong Kong, we find that the difference can be about 5 degrees Celsius between the normal seawall and the tiles. But if we look at another site that is more exposed to the sun during the day, we see that the difference can go up to 11 degrees Celsius. And here we found that all the tiles, regardless of the concrete composition or pH, had higher number of species than the controlled seawall, and the number was comparable to the natural shoreline. And there were no difference between the different type of concrete mix. And here what we found is we found higher number of mobile individuals, such as crab and gastropod. And this makes a lot of sense because the vertical seawall is flat. So this animal usually cannot stay there with the wave action. But because we are adding this three-dimensionality and horizontal surfaces, so this animal now find a niche to stay on the vertical seawalls. And on the controlled seawalls, what we found is mostly limpet, that they have no problem to stay in vertical surfaces with wave action. At the end of the 1 year trial, we collected samples of the concrete and measured the surface pH again. And this was very interesting. What we found is that pH, at least within a year, decreased to a level similar to the pH of the sea, that is around 8. So this is very important for us because now we know that we shouldn't spend effort in trying to reduce the pH at the beginning, because naturally will decrease very quickly. We did the material structure analysis of this eco-friendly concrete mixture and the normal PC, and we found that all of them performed very well, which suggests that this new concrete mixture could be suitable for building this and fabricating these units in Hong Kong. We also tested units on the riprap seawall. Here we have a different approach. We have Oyster Basket, we have armoring unit that can contain water on the top and provide shading on the side, and we have intertidal pools that can contain a larger amount of water during the low tide. So for the oyster basket, we have different components. We have oyster bags with live oyster, we have bags with only shells, and we have the basket itself. So what we found after 18 months is that the number of species and the different component is much higher than the number of species making use of the normal granite boulders of the riprap seawall. And when we look at the basket as a whole, we found about 112 species for this site that is much higher than the 36 species that we found on the seawall. And within this 18 months, more than 50% of the species appear only in this setup, which indicate that we can add more and bring more species back to these artificial seawalls. For the concrete unit, the armoring unit, and tidal pool, we also found that they help to increase the number of species compared to the controlled riprap seawall, but this number is still lower than the natural shorelines. So what we learned with this trial is that we can enhance with this feature the biodiversity of the seawalls in Hong Kong. And this feature can be used for retrofitting the seawalls. And we also learned that by increasing the surface complexity and provide microhabitat, we can bring more species back to the seawall. We also learned that for designing this feature, we should try to include different types of ridges, crevices, holes, surface texture, and water retention. And we also learned that for implementation, the more different features we combine within the seawall, we can increase the overall habitat heterogeneity of the seawall and therefore increase the total biodiversity. We also learned that our eco-friendly concrete mixture that we developed can be suitable for building this or fabricating these concrete features, and this can help us to cope with local waste, but it can also help us to lower the carbon footprint of concrete features. And we also learned that lowering pH may not be necessary for Hong Kong seawalls because it will decrease naturally very quickly. I would also like to share some images with you about some of the trials that we have been doing in mainland China. Although here I don't have like results because we haven't been able to go there because of COVID restrictions, but I would still like to share it with you because here we are working on a large land reclamation that is about 1,200 hectares. They are building a harbor, an industrial city, and here's the urban area. So we are testing different approaches to improve the biodiversity of this fully artificial shoreline. So there is a river, and when we first got there, the mudflat around the artificial seawall looked like this, like a plain mudflat. So what we did was a 400-meter plantation of mangrove with 4 species. And after 2 years, with pictures, we can see that the mangroves are growing very nicely and healthy. And now they're expanding by themselves. So this means that we managed to have a population that can stay and continue on time. And we have also seen different animals coming back and using this mangrove, like insects and marine organisms. For the riprap seawalls, we have been trying different approaches, like adding large built-in pools with bolts inside to add complexity and water retention. We also asked the contractor to rearrange the seawall to make these pockets of boulders that it can work as a nursery ground for fish in the intertidal, so big fish won't get here, and so the small one can have a safe ground. We are also testing different precast concrete units to build artificial reef, but unfortunately I don't have the result of this trial yet. But the idea with these different units is that we want to know what works and what doesn't work for these specific sites. So in collaboration with landscape architects, they can provide a design that the local government and the construction company can follow to make this artificial shoreline more natural. So it can provide some services for the community, they can enjoy it, but we can also keep levels of biodiversity and ecosystem functioning high. I would like also to talk about another project that we're doing that is inspiring the Billion Oyster project from New York, where they're using discarded shells from restaurants to bring back oyster reef and biodiversity to clear the New York harbor. So in Hong Kong, I was invited to be a founding member of the Hong Kong Marine Ecological Association. It's working as an NGO, so we have our project that is called Oyster Save Our Seas. So here we are doing the same while we are learning with the Eco Shoreline trial. We are using this entity to try to implement a larger scale. So here we want to engage the public and local businesses to restore the subtidal oyster reef to clear the water and bring biodiversity back to the harbor or most degraded areas in Hong Kong. So this is very new. We started working completely on it last year. So hopefully this year and next year is when we start making this project happen. So saying that, I would like to thank you all for listening, and also to all the different institutions and organizations from Hong Kong government and research institutions from Hong Kong that have been helping us in this project. So I think we're going to take questions after the talk of Pedro. So more than happy to listen to any question and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we're going to do our last talk. So our next panelist is Pedro Aparicio Llorente, and he will be talking about Golfo Tribuga in Colombia, in the Pacific coast of Colombia. And the title of his presentation is Ants and Moon.
Thank you, Natalia, for convening this series of conversations, and Juan Carlos for the insightful lecture, and for the APRU initiative at large. So yeah, I've titled this story Ants and Moon, a short story on multi-species technology. And it begins in this place. This is the Gulf of Triuga in the North Pacific coast of Colombia. Here we have perhaps one of the deepest gulfs in the world. And it's chosen annually by a diverse multitude of species that come and migrate to have their babies. And for example, the humpback whale that's coming from the south, almost 8,000 kilometers. We have an assortment of birds arriving, sea turtles, hammerhead sharks. And this specific map is in the airport of Nuquí, which is like the head small town of this gulf with around 40 or 50,000 inhabitants. And I really enjoy this image because, as you can see, the scale of a frog and a town or an airplane are all changing. And it generates an interesting conversation about precision in cartography, and the mentality around what is present here. It's a place mostly inhabited in its shorelines by Black communities, and inside the rivers, Embera indigenous communities, and then all these other inhabitants, as I mentioned, whales, sardines are also migrating constantly. As you can see in this drawing, we have a map of the coast of South America, and the whales have their migration all the way up to the Gulf of Triuga, which has designated it as one of the global hope spots for maintaining the oceans, the good health of the oceans, specifically for its location and involvement in the cycle of the humpback whale. Inside the Gulf, we have all these different settlements that are scattered around, but each of these places is specifically located in a river, in an estuary of the rivers that flow down from the Serranías del Baudó to find the ocean. And in all of these towns, the cycles of the moons and the tides, with the different moments of puja and quiebra, and the 8-hour cycles that we're aware of, become the clock, become the time in which things happen, in which boats either come in through the river, or boats come out, or other animals enter into the mangroves. Most of these shorelines have mangroves inside of the river, so a lot of these small villages are behaving like islands. And I will be concentrating specifically in one island, or one town island called Coquí, where I've been engaging and working for the last 3 or 4 years in different ways, from building architecture and other types of projects with local fishermen, friends, and cooks, farmers, and others. This photograph we captured of a payao, the payao, which is spelled P-A-Y-A-O. It's a specific technique of sinking trees in the ocean to make this kind of marine gardens that are then used by local fishermen to provide fish without the need of gasoline or a motorized boat. This is a photograph we captured a week after a payao was done, just before the season or the migrating time of the sardines.
Ay. Es que no lo podemos así, es que los otros me tenían que poder dar rato allá atrás. Allá atrás yo, bota más parejo. Y acá nomás. Negro, espere, usted muchacho tiene que venir acá. Venga, venga. Ahí que venimos ya acá, venga. Esta va la plan. Esta es gruesa. Allá uno se mocha allá. Hágale, yo negro, que nosotros estamos pesados. Espere. Yo, mira, abajo me golpeé. ¡Ya! ¡Vete! ¡Vete! Buen machete. Me golpeó.
So part of this transgenerational knowledge transfer in a place where there is immense ability to read the landscape and read the dynamics of how things are moving is just an example of how this local community or this traditional fishermen have been engaging for some time and evolving their techniques in relation to mangrove trees and fishing spots. This project of the Payao comes from a previous origin of integrating or looking at the landscape. Traditionally, trees that would be that would fall and come down the river and stagnate in one of the edges, eventually would be identified as places where one could bring in food or organic leftovers to propagate the habitat of fish. Basically, when a big mangrove tree falls down, it generates a lot of complex geometries that allow for small fishes to arrive and other animals to start inhabiting these places. These are parts of the drawing that we've been doing in the architecture studio Aplo that I direct with colleagues Daniela and Angela. We've been doing this series of representations and trying to understand, how we can take architectural drawing in a way to engage part of these actions, part of these practices, where a lot of this landscape knowledge is embedded, and in a way graphically, capture these moments to then share with our friends. Here we see kind of how the system works. There's different weights that bring down the tree, and a series of buoys that mark the place where the payao is settled. And then this place becomes strategically placed right before the migration of the sardine. So as we know, when the migration of the sardine arrives to this gulf, it brings with it a lot of different fish. So eventually, in the words of our friends, fishermen, this charges the payao. It's like charging, like turning the payao on. There is a very interesting relationship, and many of these towns, as we see, they settle in the in the estuaries, in the deltas, in the connections between rivers and ocean. And besides the trees that are brought in or brought down by the river, the mangroves that in the case of the Payao works with the 8-hour cycle, of course, so that it can be pushed out. Also, when trees are changing their leaves and leaves are brought down by the river, they arrive to the shoreline, and the ocean is constantly bringing leaves. But there's specific moments in this month cycle where the beaches are populated with a lot of leaves, and these leaves are collected and brought in home, left in the sun and left to dry for maybe a month. Later, there's a very precise family of leaf-cutting ants that there are endemic to this region of Colombia and Serranía del Darién region, all the way to Panama. These leaf-cutting ants, Colombica by their name, are the only of the 40 species of leaf-cutting ants that, in their very sophisticated way of managing their waste, generate a specific substrate or a specific soil called ant soil. In this region, we call it ant soil. Basically, the story of the ants, of the Colombica leaf-cutting ants and other species, is that they have evolved to have and host a fungi that lives within the ant homes. These ant homes, these fungi, has evolved parallelly with the ant, and the ants have very precise roles where cut leaves, bring them in, and share them with the fungi, generating food for the ant, but also generating waste. This waste is managed inside of the ant house and eventually taken out. And this is the only species that takes this ant soil or waste out. Fishermen, farmers, cooks, leaders, women leaders mix the leaves with the soil and generate a substrate that allows to have a very precise way of agriculture in the beach, in a sand where you could probably mostly can grow trees and fruits and coconuts and others. But when a canoe or a boat is taken out of circulation because it has broken down or it's no longer working, or there has been a new one in replacement, it generates this very beautiful technology called sotea, where in the mixture of hojarasca or the leaves and the ant soil, you can grow medicinal and herbs and aromatic plants. These plants not only are very important for culinary and for the gastronomy of this place, but also fundamental for midwives and the reproductive, let's say, cycle of families, women, and the well-birth of children. These are some photographs that I recently received from my friend Smith Valencia of the hojarasca arriving to the beaches. This is the ant soil, the mixture that it can generate, the substrate. Here's some aloe, and this is the soteas. Sotea is also the name of a restaurant, communitary restaurant that exists in this same town. It is a restaurant that began by the combination of a group of women leaders in the arts of gastronomy or traditional cooking, and one of most experimental chefs in Latin America called Leonard Espinosa. This this building was designed maybe 3 years ago It is a semicircle that eventually can complete its form. But for now, it takes its design, it borrows its design from the traditional porches in the houses in the region, but provides this curve to generate different spaces that give front to the ocean and to the mangrove. Here's a cross-section of the building. On the island, to the right, the ocean, to the left, the mangrove, on the back, the mountains of Bordeaux. And this place, in a way, starts kind of, this small building started kind of closing the cycle, and it's actually my entry point to this place, where we can start seeing that combination of the fishermen grabbing the fish in the payaos or in different other ways that I'm not showing today. Then the azoteas providing the herbs, and this place becoming this traditional kitchen. Finally, here it's like a plan view that takes us from the mangrove all the way to Sotea, the building, and the sequence of canoe farms, all the way to the boats taking out an old mangrove tree to be sunken in the ocean. And with that, I will close this short story on multi-species technologies, ant and moon. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Pedro, for the beautiful drawings. We wanted to open up questions. I think, Grace, you were going to be our moderator.
Yeah, we can start with one question that came in kind of for all of the speakers. All of your research projects and designs have been wonderfully context specific, but are there any kind of key takeaways or principles from each of your projects that could be perhaps adapted to other coastal landscapes? I don't know if anyone wants to start on that.
Well, I can start.
Sure, thanks.
Yeah, because, okay, we're working in Hong Kong, where it's a subtropical, tropical environment. But at the end, all the different features that we are doing and testing, it can be applied in other cities or developing cities that are facing the same problem. Of course, the output or results is going to be different because we have different communities that we want to enhance. But I would say the ecological patterns behind are quite the same. So it can be transferable to different areas, especially the concrete made features. And those features that we got from the Israeli company, they have been tested also in different places in the world, from Europe to the US and other places. And they seem to show the same result at the end. But at the end, it's about how much the local governments are willing to invest to restore these artificial shorelines. So I would say, yeah, it can be applied in many other places.
Yeah, I also, yeah, I think the question is right to say that it's very specific to Hong Kong, but I would say also to Hong Kong and to Asia in general, where these intertidal areas are being mostly contested. That there's land reclamation. It's very typical of Hong Kong, but it's also happening in China, and it's happening in other places in Asia as well. So this is subtropical areas. So there's specific habitats in this area, but I think there's similar conditions that can be shared in other contexts as well.
I would perhaps add to that I think that there's something very beautiful that happens in the Gulf of Trinidad, that is a very intimate relationship between food, midwifery, and the mangroves. So I would imagine that that is something that happens in many places. How can we start eating through the intertidal zones? Something that connects us very basically to the habitat and provides maybe very close, I mean, as Juan Carlos puts it, you know, spaces of enjoyment, but in very basic ways. Just how can we make of these places, yeah, edible?
Yeah, but it's also different cultural practices in Hong Kong. For example, the intertidal area is quite big for foraging. So there's a lot of clammers, traditional clammers. There's oyster farming. There's like you normally see in these sand, in these mud flats or sand flats, you see a lot of people basically foraging, looking for clams and oysters. So I think the relation, like I think that's true, that the intertidal zone has this relationship to culture and communities through food is one way that I think you could see it around the world.
Thank you all for that. I think we had one other question come in. I'll read from Christina. For your important work regenerating intertidal and coastal zones in Hong Kong, are you also working with relevant local city government departments and leaders so they understand the importance and long-term positive impact such work has had for the city? It seems important to ensure that the city, Hong Kong, and also other cities incorporate such work as part of long-term sustainable urban planning.
Yes, I think we have been quite lucky because all these projects of rehabilitation are within the government agenda. So it's the Civil Engineering and Development Department and the Development Bureau in Hong Kong that they're also promoting, and we're in close collaboration because they want to do artificial shorelines more environmentally friendly. And we are the one trying to find out. So they're very active. I would say in that sense, we are quite lucky. It's very early still because it takes a while to really know how to optimize the seawalls. But we are very lucky that the government is very supportive and they really want to engage in this new way of building seawalls. So for that point, it's quite good. I think the side that we're weak at the moment is the public engagement. We haven't done much outreach so far, but we are starting to work on this with this new NGO that we want to bring the citizens to understand and how they can help to restore their own city. So hopefully this will start happening within 1 or 2 years. Yeah, well, I can also complement that. Like 2 weeks at the beginning of the year, from 3rd to 7th of January, we have a workshop on eco shoreline. So we also have interaction with researchers and engineers and even government officials from other countries. And overall, it seems to be a trend on doing ecological engineering for rehabilitating this artificial shoreline. And I think it's many countries are trying to adapt it. It's just the adaptation is shorter or slower than the development ongoing. So there is a mismatch, but hopefully within a decade or 2 decades, it will become a standard in building artificial shorelines.
Thank you. We did have another question just pop in from Christopher. How do you see your research supporting resilience of local communities regarding climate change? I don't know if this is directed at any one presenter in particular, but is there anyone who'd like to speak to that?
I'll jump in. I think that in the case of Triuga, where there is in a way, this place is peripheral to Colombia, right? To the country that is very centralized in the mountains. A lot of young people are finding their way out of these places. You know, there's a migration happening, maybe in the difference than from Hong Kong, that people are arriving in these places. It's more like Detroit, you know, people are leaving. So it's shrinking in a way. So I think that there's an importance here in these practices. It's to kind of recognize that transfer of knowledge between elders and young generations, and invite, in a way, as a restaurant is doing, to take to the highest level of contemporary cuisine, for example, the traditions that are hosted in these places. Not necessarily to limit people to stay there, but to at least recognize that there's opportunities, right? And opportunities that go perhaps beyond the portuary or hard infrastructure desires that are quite centralized as well, but that maintaining, in a way, this hope spot or large biodiversity, in a way, has fostered very beautiful practices that are, in a way, could be very lucrative, right? So I think that in that sense, there is an importance in that condition, regarding patterns of migration in this place specifically.
Yeah, I can also complement from our perspective in Hong Kong. I mean, based on our research, yeah, we keep in mind climate change because it's unavoidable. I mean, in summer here we suffer from typhoons. We have seen how typhoons, the surge start inundating reclaimed areas. So we are considering this. We are developing a guideline for, hopefully it can be used by government or other construction companies. So some consideration that they should keep in mind for the future scenario. So we are considering that, okay, this seawall had to be increased in size because the waves are going to be stronger, but also the designs of these seawalls is to try to reduce the environmental stress like heat stress and desiccation, which is going to become intensified in the future with climate change. So and the intertidal is going to be like a battlefield for many organisms because the temperature will go way up. So we need to find ways how to provide microhabitat for these animals to stay there. But I mean, that's happening. But in Hong Kong, we also have like more immediate problems, that is pollution and habitat loss. That I would say if we start trying to deal with those one, I think somehow we are at the same time working and preparing the communities for the future, for high resilience. So I think, yeah, we are trying to target this climate change issue as well.
Yeah, in terms of the studios that I teach, they're centered on issues of climate change and sea level rise. We worked with green groups in the studio, which not so much with the local communities, but more with green groups. But I think the role of the studio is also kind of, because at the end, it's this critique on development. Because the way that the government has done development in Hong Kong is always pro-development, and development goes first, conservation goes second, or gets fixed after. So I think in a way, working with green groups and students themselves to kind of become more passionate about issues is the way to get them involved with communities later on. Because the big problem of Hong Kong is there's lack of conservation by the government. There's a lack of interest in conservation. So I think this is kind of like what the students get to push a bit more.
We don't have any other questions that have come in since that one. So audience, if you have anything else, go ahead and put it in the chat or the Q&A box now. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to either Natalia or Yegon for any closing words.
Yeah, while we are waiting any other questions, I'd like to really thank you for the speakers for your wonderful presentations. And I definitely agree with Natalia about this is a really generalizable issues, especially across the Pacific Rim. And I'm, also as well from South Korea, that we had a lot of these issues around the land reclamation and protecting tidal flats. And so there's a lot of efforts and tension because we have so much pressure on developing and expanding the land as a small country with a high population density. So I definitely, this is a really important and critical issues across the Pacific Rim. So I think you guys really showed really a way that how this design and the ecological engineering approach and also like traditional knowledge and wisdom can interweaving together to really increase the efforts of promoting more tidal intertidal zone conservation. So I really appreciate all your really inspiring case studies. And your the title of the webinar was engaging the intertidal zones, and now I understand why you made your title with engaging, because I really found that engagement is the key. Especially, for example, like there are several efforts around try to prove the value of the intertidal zones. For example, like maybe economists calculate the the dollar value of the intertidal flats, or scientists also calculate how much carbon the tidal flat can absorb. And so there is some of the also like ecological engineering approach. We also try to show the performance of the more complex natural shoreline versus simple developed shorelines. And but I think one of the really compelling way would be really visualizing this complex and diverse engagement with human and non-human species. And the design can play a really important role in that. So I was really inspired and learned a lot about from your case studies, that how our profession can also work with other disciplines to increase these efforts. So I really appreciate that. I'm really curious to hear more about your international network of teaching studios around the coastal areas that Natalia briefly showed. And you had a lot of like this Red Cross across the Pacific Rim. Is it the universities or like, are you recruiting?
No, it was more, it was, no, I'm recruiting. I'm mostly recruiting because I think like I've started collaborating. We started the Coastal Issues studio, Resilience, with Berkeley. And that was the first studio that I showed. And last year was with UCLA and other universities, also in the APRU, but that was dealing with also kind of in the case of Hong Kong was storm surge and typhoons, so it was disasters. But just thinking, like the third studio that I did was more focused on the intertidal zone. All of the studios were coastal, but this one was more focused on the intertidal zone. But I just think that this could lead to a bigger conversation. I started talking to Pedro because Pedro was working with mangroves also, and thinking about doing parallel studios in the future, because the issues are so different, but the conditions are so different. But I think you would probably have similar issues across all these areas. The conditions of climate, the conditions of development are different, but there's going to be similar issues. So I think as thinking about as a larger super studio, even of in collaboration of understanding kind of intertidal zone would be an interesting way to continue this project.
It's an excellent idea, and I love to think about how the SCL can help with that. And definitely also University of Oregon, our department also has several studios around the Oregon coast. And I'm sure we can make a call to collect all these studio outcomes, across the Pacific Rim to, start to maybe archiving and visualizing through the websites or something like that. So, and then maybe like in the future, you can make a call for like a super studio types of, collaboration. That sounds really fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Yekang, for having us today. And thank you for the audience for being here also in the morning of Hong Kong and evening in Oregon and the other side of the world from us here in Hong Kong.
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much for all the speakers today. Talia and Juan and Pedro. Yeah, and is there any other questions or do we? No?
No.
And thank you again, Christina and Chris from APRU headquarters who attended our session today and asking really important questions. Really appreciate your support. Let's think about how SCL can help this, help out this Spurs Studio effort. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Much.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank
bye.
you, Grace. Bye.
Bye bye.